Is ready. We'll have the statement on flooding. Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and Happy New Year to everybody in the House. I'd like to update the House on the current flooding situation in England. I'd like to start by extending my heartfelt sympathies to all the people and businesses affected. Having your home or place of work flooded at any time is a horrendous experience, but is particularly dreadful at a time of hope and celebration for individuals and communities, and I hope that those affected will be able to rebuild in the days ahead. This current flooding is the latest set of flood events to occur in what has already been a challenging autumn and winter storm season. A combination of heavy rain, snow and high winds have affected England since the 30th of December, with the worst rain arriving on the 1st of January. Many New Year's Eve celebrations were cancelled, and people in the North West and Central England woke up in the new year to find rivers at record levels, roads, car parks, businesses and, unfortunately, dozens of homes flooded. Last night has seen further heavy rain and flooding affecting transport infrastructure and other services. And the Environment Agency's current areas of most concern today focus on the Midlands, Warwickshire, Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire, and in Leicestershire, the Fire and Rescue have declared a major incident. There remains extensive amounts of floodwater in rivers and other bodies of water, and a lot of the ground is saturated. The extent of flooding in fields and on our transport infrastructure and in the news and social media shows us the impact that water has on our communities. As Right Honourable Members will appreciate, this is an ongoing and dynamic situation, but I wanted to come here and provide the latest and most detailed updates possible on what is happening and how we are responding. So turning to the flooding on New Year's Eve, the heavy rainfall was forecast by the Met Office, who issued rainfall warnings across most of England, including an amber rain warning for large areas of the North West. 164 flood warnings and 154 flood alerts were issued by the Environment Agency between New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And rain fell across large parts of England, with the worst impacted areas in the North West, including Cheshire, Greater Manchester, Lancashire and parts of Yorkshire, and the highest ever levels on the River Mersey were recorded. Environment team agents operated flood basins at Catterall, Garston, Croydon in Lancashire and Lilford, Sale and Didsbury in Greater Manchester. And Cheshire was a specific area of concern, declaring a major incident with over 100 families needing evacuation in the Warrington area. A large section of embankment at the Bridgewater Canal collapsed, with water draining onto farmland and inundating a wastewater treatment works owned by United Utilities. The owner of the canal is Peel Holdings, who took emergency action to stop the flow of water, and while the treatment work was inaccessible for a time, United Utilities have assured us that the plant is back up and running. A number of evacuations were needed, even where properties were not flooded, including the Britannia Hotel in Didsbury, and Manchester required an evacuation of 400 residents. While some of the heavy rain has passed by the 2nd of January, subsequent cold weather impacted much of the same areas, hampering recovery efforts and adding further misery for those whose homes have flooded. Environment Agency staff continued their work across the country and brought in mutual aid from unaffected areas to help efforts in the worst areas hit. They were also operating defences, supporting emergency response partners in managing live incidents and continuing to issue flood warnings to warn and advise communities at risk. Late yesterday evening, further heavy rainfall fell across parts of England, and this has led to a combination of river and surface water flooding. The EA are continuing to respond in affected areas, including in the Midlands, Leicestershire, Derbyshire, Birmingham, Nuneaton, Loughborough, and the River Trent, Avon and Idle. The Environment Agency are reporting at least 350 properties have flooded and over 21,000 properties protected since New Year's Eve. Over the next 24 to 36 hours, as water moves to the lower reaches and slower responding catchments, there will likely be some localised flooding across multiple smaller areas. Now, climate change will inevitably lead to more severe weather of the kind we've seen this weekend. But I want to reassure the House that flooding is a personal priority for me and one of our top 5 priorities in DEFRA. This government inherited flood defences in the worst condition on record following years of underinvestment. Due to the impacts of inflation and ageing asset base and no additional funding being made available by the previous government to repair storm damage, flood defence integrity is at its lowest since 2009-10, with approximately 60,000 properties less well protected than if flood defences were at an optimal condition. This is why we're investing £2.4 billion over the next 2 years to build and maintain flood defences. We've also set up a new flood resilience task force to make sure there is better coordination between central government and the frontline agencies in the ground and up and down the country, bringing together organisations including the Association of Drainage Authorities, the National Farmers Union, local resilience forums and emergency responders. It is key to strengthening resilience in the face of floods, and they met for the first time in September and will be meeting later this month. We've also provided £60 million to help farmers affected by the unprecedented flooding last winter, and an additional £50 million will be distributed to internal drainage boards to manage water levels to protect the environment and agriculture. To make the most of our flood forming, we'll be refreshing our approach to funding flood defences, including a review of the existing flood funding formula, to ensure the challenges facing businesses and rural and coastal communities are taken into account when delivering flood protection. We were going to consult on this new approach in the new year, and of course I'll inform all members when that consultation is live. And we aim to bring the approach in from April 2026. The Environment Agency community and field teams are out today to assess and report on the impacts from the last 24 hours, and I'm sure the whole House will join me in thanking the emergency services, local authorities and the Environment Agency and volunteers for their work in keeping communities, properties and businesses safe. Yeah. And I'd like to also recognise the work done by many local MPs and their constituents, including Jopp, the MP for Lee and Atherton. Residents in Lilford and Lee have been impacted twice by flooding in recent years. This is proof that resilient methods and investment need to be reassessed constantly, and we as a government are committed to supporting residents to do that. And I know as well, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are many more MPs who wanted to be here, but because of flooding, they're out supporting their constituents. So I'd like to give thanks to all of those and mention James Nash in Rushcliffe, who is out supporting constituents right now. I held a call on Friday for MPs to be updated, and I'm grateful the Shadow Minister was able to join that, and I'll continue to communicate with members as they raise issues. Flooding is such an important issue, and I will work tirelessly to make our communities more resilient to flooding, and I commend the statement to the House.
Thank you. Before I call the Shadow Minister, just a reminder, it is protocol to reference Members of Parliament by their constituencies and not by their names. And I'll call the Shadow Minister, Dr Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for advance sight of her statement. I would also like to put on record my gratitude to the Minister and her whole team for hosting the very constructive and helpful cross-party meeting on Friday, together with officials from DEFRA, the Environment Agency, the Met Office and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Thank you. On behalf of His Majesty's opposition, I would like to pay tribute to the emergency services, local authorities, the Environment Agency for their efforts over this challenging festive period and now ongoing into the start of the working year to help people quickly and often in dangerous circumstances. I would also like to thank members of the public, volunteer groups and indeed our amazing farmers who once again have stepped in to help their neighbours and their local communities during these difficult times. The current flooding and snow and rain has had and continues to have hugely detrimental impacts right across the United Kingdom. Today roads are closed, many schools have been unable to reopen on what should have been the first day of term, rail services have been suspended and airports have experienced extreme delays. Furthermore, as the Minister has said, as a result of the extreme weather, Leicestershire Fire and Rescue Service have declared a major incident across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. Our thoughts are with all of those whose homes and businesses have been damaged and to all those who continue to be affected. Many of these people will be distressed, angry and completely exhausted as they begin this new year with the process of restoring and rebuilding their homes and businesses. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm a bit like a broken record on this, but I reiterate, we must not underestimate the mental health impacts that flooding has on communities, both in terms of the anxiety of being flooded, but also the trauma when flooding does hit. It is essential that practical support is provided as quickly as possible and remains in place after the waters have subsided and the blue lights have departed. Can the Minister update us on the action the government is taking to try to get schools open as soon as possible, and what steps her department is taking to ensure that insurance claims can be processed as quickly as possible so that those affected can return to their homes as soon as they can? In addition, what steps is the government taking to review and potentially expand the Vital Flood Re-scheme so that insurance cover is expanded in terms of age of building eligibility, but also looking at expanding it to including businesses? And I know this is something that we discussed on the cross-party meeting on Friday. In government, the Conservatives ring-fenced £100 million to help communities threatened by repeated flooding. Can the Minister commit to that funding, and will those affected by flooding again in this latest period of bad weather be eligible to apply? Furthermore, can the Minister provide assurances that the discretionary funding, such as the Flood Recovery Framework or the Bellwin scheme, will be implemented to alleviate the effects of flooding, even if potentially thresholds of numbers of properties affected are sometimes not met? Will the Minister and her colleagues across government commit to a compassionate, pragmatic and case-by-case approach in awarding this vital discretionary funding? Additionally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the previous Conservative government established the Farming Recovery Fund to support farmers recovering from uninsurable damage. Can the Minister confirm whether the government will renew this Conservative initiative and now provide new funding for this winter's storms? Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State has set up a Floods Resilience Task Force to improve flood preparedness, which has only met once. What work did the task force do ahead of this latest bad weather? And shouldn't it meet more regularly, and certainly before the end of this month, as the Minister has just stated, to learn any lessons and to respond to these ever-dynamic weather events that we have seen in recent weeks? With many warnings for flooding still in place, I know that many will be experiencing huge anxiety and uncertainty, and I will conclude by wishing every community and the services and people supporting them a safe period moving forward.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll try and answer as many as I possibly can, and I do want to start by sharing his concern on the mental health impact that flooding has on people. It really can't be exaggerated to say how losing and having your home damaged, having to move out over winter has a devastating impact on you. And again, agree that the farmers have done a great job in supporting communities at risk of flooding. Some of the points the Honourable Gentleman made around flood re, we haven't got plans at the moment to extend the scope. However, we are regularly reviewing all policies. So if there's any honourable members in the House want to contact me with any specifics or suggestions around flood re, then I'm very open to receiving them. On the different pockets of funding that the previous government announced, we're going to look at flood funding formula in a whole and look at how it all works. This is what I mentioned about the review of the formula. So I'll let him know as soon as that becomes live so he can join in the consultation. And we should be able to announce the schemes that are being funded, hopefully by next month. And I know that people have been very impatient to have that information sooner, and we have worked as quickly as we possibly can. In terms of Bellwin, and then there's a formula in terms of when Bellwin is activated or not. It has to hit a certain, local authority has to hit a certain level of expenditure to activate Bellwin. And on the Farming Recovery Fund, we've been really pleased that money from that fund has arrived in farmers' bank accounts already. So we've been getting that money out the door to the people who need you the most.
Select Committee Member Tim Roca.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also join members of both front benches in paying tribute to communities and volunteers and neighbours who helped each other with the floods over recent days. Communities in my part of the world, Madam Deputy Speaker, particularly in Poynton and Bollington, were affected and they all pulled together. But what I want to ask is about the A555 road, which runs through a number of constituencies who are represented in this House. Poor engineering has been raised several times for why it floods and affects local residents. Will she join me in speaking with the Department of Transport and local authorities and trying to get to the bottom of why it repeatedly ends up failing our residents?
And thank you, Madam Deputy. And I thank my honourable friend for his question and for the work he's doing supporting his community in this really difficult time. And if I can be of assistance in talking to the Department for Transport, then of course I will be.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. New Environment Agency modelling shows that 1 in 4 properties in England could be at risk of flooding by 2050, including an additional 39,000 homes in the southwest. I, like many across Glastonbury and Somerton, watch this happening in real time. Residents are on high alert, they're anxious, and their mental health is suffering. Knoll is a small hamlet between Langport and Somerton that has previously never flooded, and it saw 9 homes flood every month last winter. Now, with just 40 houses in the hamlet, these incidents have a huge impact on the local community. A resident who was affected told me that they had to watch the ingress of water through every wall in their house, while another said they had been unable to return home until midsummer after the winter flooding last year. Their experiences and those of many residents across Somerset and those that are set out in the National Flood Risk Assessment show us that heavier rainfall and rising sea levels is already threatening 2.4 million properties. So will the Minister commit to ensuring agencies like Natural England and the Environment Agency are properly funded to deal with flooding and future flooding?
Thank you, and I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and again she's right to point out the mental health impact this has on people. In terms of communities that are experiencing repeated flooding over and over again, I would urge her to invite them to look at the Build Back Better scheme, where they could be able to access an extra £10,000 to make their homes more resilient to flooding. And of course, as I said, this is something I care deeply about, and so does the department, which is why we're investing £2.4 billion into delivering and improving and maintaining the flood defences that we have.
Jo White.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Mr Wilson of Blackstone Lane in Retford contacted me this morning, worried that water was once again coming close to his property. He's been flooded out many times, but today I would like to thank the Minister for the work of the Environment Agency. They were on site with their pumps from the early hours of this morning, and they tell me that the clearance works on local culverts has made a difference, and the water has been kept at bay. Mr Wilson's hope is that this will continue.
Thank you, and I'm really pleased to share her thanks with the Environment Agency. They do an incredible job. I mean, they were out there working New Year's Day, New Year's Eve, not celebrating like I think many of us maybe were here, but going out helping and supporting. So I'm really pleased to hear that positive story from her constituency.
Lincoln Jopp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The people of Spelthorne have been holding their breath during this flood season, and obviously prevention is better than cure. Can the Minister give us an update on the River Thames scheme and when any decision about whether it's going to go ahead and when is going to be taken?
Thank you for your important question. I just mentioned in my response to the Shadow Minister that we should be able to announce which schemes have been successful or not by next month at the latest. But if he wants to write to me with more information, I can give him more of a detailed response on the scheme he mentions. But I do recognise how important so many of these schemes are to so many people.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have been personally affected by flooding. In 1985, our family home was flooded when the River Coldew in Carlisle burst its banks, and I can testify, as we've already heard, to the terror and the powerlessness that you feel when your home is invaded by water. Although over the last few weeks we have escaped flooding in Carlisle on this occasion, it is 20 years tomorrow since Carlisle was flooded and 3 residents lost their lives. Margaret Threlkeld, Margaret Porter and Michael Scott died in the 2005 floods. At that point, the Labour government commissioned and completed flood defences, but they proved insufficient to hold back the River Eden in 2015, and the city was further flooded again. Flood defences were commissioned but not completed by the last government. Does the Minister agree with me that it is unacceptable that the residents of Carlisle have been left unprotected as a result of the inaction from the last government.
I thank my honourable friend for her question, and hearing the news of anybody who loses their life in a flood event is truly devastating, and my sympathies are with the family and loved ones of those victims. And she's quite right to point out the importance of delivering on the promise to build the flood defences, and she's quite right as well to highlight that leaving flood defences in such a poor maintenance puts more homes at risk of flooding, an additional 60,000 homes at risk of flooding. But I have no doubt, because she has proven already to be, Madam Deputy Speaker, a fantastic champion in getting hold of me at every available opportunity to advocate for her constituent, and long may she continue to do so.
Mr McVey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A number of my constituents have been affected by flooding and in a variety of ways. And the Minister mentioned in her opening statement the breach of the Bridgewater Canal, the damage that has caused in Cheshire, and the immediate repair work that needs to be done by Peel. But can the Minister let me know what is being done to ensure that local authorities clear blocked drains? Because that is the root of most of the flooding.
I thank the Honourable Lady, a right Honourable Lady, for her question, and she's right to point out that we need a combination of things to deal with flooding. There is a concern around the canal, which I'm aware of, and grateful for her mentioning it, but it is also important to look at lots of different things, including clearing out culverts, clearing out drains where appropriate. But there's many things I think need to be done together to ensure that we build resilience to flooding. We can't, put all our eggs in one basket, but certainly the more that we can do, and taking some of these smaller actions will have a cumulative effect and will help the situation.
Jeevun, Sandher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the last 24 hours, heavy rainfall has led to flooding in my constituency in Loughborough, Corn and Hudson. And a year ago, the Prime Minister visited Loughborough when that bout of flooding ruined homes. We are both deeply moved. The Secretary of State as well has also visited those homes. I'm grateful that the Minister has strengthened flood defences since she was appointed. I'm incredibly grateful that this time the flood has left less damage, but heavier rainfall will come due to climate change. Can the Minister set out how this government will protect homes in my community, and will she meet with me to discuss how we can do everything we can to protect our homes?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and again he's right to point out how devastating flooding is. Of course I'd be happy to meet with him and discuss the situation that is in his constituency, but just to reassure him, we are going to be spending £2.4 billion in the next 2 years to strengthen, improve and maintain our flood defences.
Glen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The £30 million investment in the River Park scheme around Salisbury has been a fantastic intervention. But could I urge the Minister to continue to work with the Environment Agency to find mechanisms where parishes can work collaboratively with the Environment Agency to develop smaller schemes? And would she also recognise that beyond the crisis management that she and the Environment Agency are working on at the moment, there is an issue around concern of new development and not adequate scrutiny of increased flood risks around that extra development. And I think it's really important, if we're to reassure our constituents when more housing is put into the mix, that there is a proper consideration of the effect it has on flood risk, because many people in Salisbury remain very concerned about the outcomes of that.
Thank you. And the Honourable Gentleman is always welcome to urge me to do many things. So I think that proposal around how the Environment Agency works with local parishes is an interesting one, and sort of happy to hear more of his thoughts on that. Just to reassure people about new homes, we have committed to ensure we're building more high-quality, well-designed, sustainable homes and making sure that they are not going to increase flood risk nor be at risk of flooding. And where developments need to be in locations where there is risk of flooding as alternative sites are not available, those developments must be flood resilient and resistant, safe for its lifetime and not increase overall flood risk.
Rachael Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do want to put on record my thanks to the City of York council workers as well as the Environment Agency who are out over the new year protecting our city. However, many businesses in my city periodically do flood, and I do want to press the Minister to think again about having a review of the insurance system working for businesses so we can ensure that they have the resilience and confidence moving forward.
And Thank my honourable friend for her question and for joining my call that we held with all of the different organisations on the Friday. And I kind of anticipated this might be the question that I get pushed on. And again, I have to admire her persistence on this. Of course, if she wants to sort of, give me more information, I understand the importance of floodway. I understand the importance of businesses having insurance. The floodway scheme was originally designed in a very specific way. But of course, I'm always happy to have further representations from my friend.
Layla Moran.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I had an email from a constituent, Laura, in Abingdon. She lives in an area that's been flooded 3 times in the last year. In fact, there's a flood warning for the River Ock again today. And she says that because of the flooding, she has found herself in a position where she can't sell her house, nor can any of her neighbours. The estate agents say it needs to be 5 years dry before they'll even consider it. As a result, they stand to lose millions between them, and to boot, they've both lost jobs because they can't move now. What work is the department doing with estate agents and the building industry so that houses that are newly built are built well, but also those that need to be sold can be?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. As I outlined in response earlier, there is we are going to ensure that any new homes built are either resistant to flooding, and also importantly don't contribute to more flooding in other areas as well, because that's incredibly important. Now, I don't know the details of the area and the constituents that she's mentioned, or whether or not there's a flood scheme in ready to be developed in that area, or whether or not they've thought about property flood resilience measures or various things. But if she wants to give you more information, then I'd happy to look at it.
Adam Jogee.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for the call on Friday, and I welcome her commitment to supporting my constituents and improving our flood defences. But to reiterate the point already made by the member opposite, as well as defences, it's very much about maintaining existing infrastructure, and particularly having and making sure our drains are unblocked. And in Newcastle-under-Lyme, Staffordshire County Council have a very important role to play in that, but sadly are very much missing in action. So can I ask the Minister what engagement she's had with local government, and will she meet with me to discuss the specific flooding challenges faced by my constituents in Madeley, Cividale, Crossheath, the subways in town and in All Sages Bank?
I thank my honourable friend, and part of the reason we wanted to set up the Flood Resilience Task Force is to end this silo working between different government organisations, which is why it's joint chaired not just by myself but by the Minister for MHCLG as well, so that we're both looking at where issues overlap. But of course, how can I turn down an invitation to meet with my honourable friend?
Committee Member Sarah Bool.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. An issue across my constituency, whether that's in Brendan or Bugbrook, is that the flood warnings are actually coming hours after the flood events have occurred. So can I ask what actions the Minister will take to make sure that these flood warnings are timely and accurate?
I thank the Honourable Lady for that question, and that's a really important question, and I'm grateful that she's raised it. Of course, in the majority of situations, the flood warnings went out, people were given time and notice, and I will again plug, please everybody encourage your constituents to sign up for flood warnings. But where there's been a situation where the warning wasn't received in time, then I'm looking at that now with the Met Office and the Environment Agency to understand why that's happened and how we can improve it in the future, because we need to ensure that people are getting those warnings as quickly as possible so they can take the actions needed.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I visited the village of Woolston in my constituency this morning. I met the council emergency teams, I met members of the flood action group. I saw the community spirit in action with refreshments being supplied by the volunteers at the Baptist Church. Most importantly, I visited residents who had been suffering. One of the issues that was raised with me was the Property Flood Resilience Grant and its operation. Residents mentioned that they need to find £800 for a survey. Additionally, that contractors ask for £300 before they give a quote. They talked about major delays, and I actually saw the consequences of those delays because some of the houses that were flooded would have benefited from the preventative measures. So would the Minister agree to take a look at that mechanism and write to me about it? Thank you.
I thank my noble friend for his question, and of course where we have schemes that are not working as effectively as they should, where there's room for improvement, then this government will make sure it does everything it can to improve things and make things better. So of course happy to receive that communication.
Ellie Childs. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like the Shadow Minister, I feel like a bit of a stuck record on the topic of flooding. This is the 4th month running on which I've spoken on it in the House. Because it's the 4th month running in which my constituency of North Herefordshire has been flooded. Today, roads are inundated, trains are cancelled, homes are taking in water. Yet again, 4th month running. Now, in the Secretary, in the Minister's speech, she mentioned the fact that climate change means these incidents will become more frequent and severe. But there was no mention explicitly of climate adaptation in the measures that you've set out. And our response to this, we surely have to take the challenge of climate adaptation seriously as a whole of government challenge. The chair of the Committee on Climate Change said the UK is not ready. So can the Minister say what is she doing with colleagues across government to ensure that we take the challenge of climate adaptation as seriously as possible? Because otherwise we will be back here month after month.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. And I can't speak for all of government, but certainly I can speak for what we're doing in terms of what property flood resilience, which is indeed just that. How do we make our homes more resilient to flooding? Because we know that flooding is going to become more frequent because we know the changes to climate adaptation. So this is an area I'm very keen, which is why I met with all the insurance companies last year to bring them all together, because I want 100%, I want every single insurance company to offer Build Back Better to start to get more homes, making them property flood resilience. And of course it's important that we don't just look at retrofitting what we already have, but also what's happening in terms of new builds as well.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to echo the Minister's heartfelt sympathies for those at the impact of flooding and those who are also in fear of future flooding. And I'd also like to echo her thanks to the services and the communities who help those victims. In Drayton and Farlington, in my constituency, groundwater floods up through the drains into houses, drives, gardens and businesses. And despite being contacted by residents and by myself, Southern Water have not acted because it is not sewage. I would like to see DEFRA working with water companies and local government to ensure this type of flooding is also taken seriously, to ensure residents and businesses are listened to and improve resilience in our drainage systems.
I thank my honourable friend, and I share her upset about the fact that this is not being taken seriously enough by Southern Water, but I have no doubt, having known my honourable friend for a very long time, that there's somebody who will make them listen. It is certainly her, and I'm happy to support her with that.
Lewis Cocking.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to draw members' attention to my register of interests. And firstly, I'd like to thank everyone that's been out over the last few days helping. Every time there is heavy rainfall or a storm, roads all across Broxbourne flood, from Stansted Abbots to Waltham Cross. What action will her department take to decrease flooding events in built-up areas? And we in Broxbourne haven't always seen the good side of the Environment Agency, so what can we do to increase the accountability of the Environment Agency as well?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I'm sorry to hear the experience of the Environment Agency hasn't been what he expects. I'll be more than happy to put him in touch with the EA Area Director so that they can have that conversation and work out how to improve the situation. In terms of urban flooding, that's one of the reasons we want to look at something called SUD, Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems, and how we can integrate more of those into our communities to help deal with some of the problems around surface water flooding.
Luke Charters.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I firstly thank and congratulate my honourable friend, the Minister, for how she's engaged members of this House and how she supported me and my constituents in delivering a pump at Hartrig Oaks. Can I invite her to support another scheme at Fulford-Fordlands Road area, which would dramatically reduce the risk of flooding in that area?
Very charming, Madam Deputy Speaker, very charming. Making it always harder to say no. I'd be happy to look into the scheme in more detail.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Every time we have a major storm or sustained rainfall, the A35 at the Baker's Arms roundabout becomes impassable, trapping the people of the Purbeck and the town of Wareham onto the Isle of Purbeck, ironically. What is the Minister doing to bring together the Department for Transport, Environment Agency, Highways England and the local authorities to plan for main routes to be prioritised for permanent flooding solutions?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and it's a really important question because I think we've seen that particularly today and in the last couple of days that many of our highways have been impacted, and indeed, as we mentioned here, railways have been impacted. I found it more difficult to get down here, and I know other honourable members have as well. So she's quite right that we should look at working together on this, and this might be one of the actions we look at in the Flood Resilience Task Force.
Ashley Dalton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also want to echo the words of many across the House for the work of statutory services in our constituents, and particularly all those that worked in West Lancashire, and our community spirit, which has been exceptional. I particularly want to note the work of Laura Corns, my constituent from the Ormskirk Community Group, who has coordinated volunteers on the ground and run a crowdfunder and raised over £5,000 already to support local people affected by floods. I welcome the Minister's statement today and many of the announcements, particularly the £50 million for internal drainage boards. Now, my honourable friend will be aware that there are some parts of the country, like mine in West Lancashire, that can't get one because we don't have an existing board and legislation prevents the creation of a new one. Can she tell me what sort of timeline we're looking at to bring forward this legislation so that we can really move forward on flood prevention and water management in West Lancashire?
Yeah. I thank my noble friend, and congratulations to her constituent who's managed to raise that £5,000. That's incredible. And that is one of the things. I am at heart an optimist, and I have to say, always see the bright side. The silver lining in the clouds that we have been definitely the communities coming together and people working together despite the horrible situations that they've been facing. And in terms of what work's being done on creating more internal drainage boards, it's something that I'm working on at the moment. I'm sorry I can't give an exact timeline, but I can tell her it's something I'm working on right now.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's widely known that the more impermeable land is, so for example, if that's pavements, roads, housing developments, the more likely we are to see flooding. With this in mind, and bearing in mind also the Minister's response earlier on ensuring that new housing developments aren't at risk of flooding, what assessment has the government taken of the downstream impacts of where you have a development? What's happening further down the valley in regards to the flooding?
Thank you, and that's an important question. That's one of the things, without going into this in too much detail, one of the important things when we're looking at sustainable urban drainage solutions, how are they going to work in communities for exactly that reason, because you can't solve a problem in one area and say, well, actually we're dealing with the flooding there if it creates a problem somewhere else. So it's exactly part of the calculation that's need to be made if you're going to use SUDs in new developments to make sure that that isn't going to impact or increase the likelihood of flooding somewhere else. Otherwise it's not effectively working. So it's a really important issue, and I'm grateful she's raised it.
Amanda Hack.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for her statement. As a major incident has been declared in Leicestershire, I want to thank our emergency responders, our local government and the Environment Agency, but also I want to thank and honour the amazing work of our flood volunteers. I spoke to one this morning. She's exhausted. She's been up all night, so I want to pay tribute to her. Could the Minister confirm how local communities like mine in Measham, Packton, Longwatton, my constituency, will be supported long-term to recover from repeated flood events? At what point will we see a stop to these events in our communities?
I thank my honourable friend, and I'm sure her constituent has done an incredible job, and the flood groups have done an amazing job, and I understand why she must be feeling so exhausted. And we've mentioned before the impact that flood events have upon people's mental health as well. In terms of areas at risk of repeated flooding, I think that's one of the things we want to look at with the flooding formula review, to make sure that the areas that are at frequent risk of flooding are getting the support that they need. In terms of the immediate post-flood situation, of course, that is a situation for MHCLG, but if I can help in any way, then she only needs to contact me.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and Happy New Year to everyone. I think many of us recognise that our drainage network is in disrepair in many, many places. Much of this stems from the Environment Agency's main river designation, which requires an enormous amount of bureaucracy to get permission in order to unblock what is nominally called a main river, but to almost all of us is a ditch. And these ditch networks are very, very broad. So in Northmoor and Bablock Hythe, in my constituency of Witney, virtually every ditch is a main river, which means that you require about 3 years in one case to get a permit from the EA. And that makes it extremely difficult, and nothing ever gets we've had 5 permits in 5 years from the EA throughout the West Oxfordshire district. So would she please consider 2 things with the EA? One is making it easier to de-designate main rivers down to ordinary watercourses. And secondly, would she simplify the EA's permit procedure, which is incredibly Byzantine now, and make it simpler so that people can apply to get the permits and then be able to de-block their ditches? Thank you.
I thank the Minister for his question, and I'm incredibly interested in what he's had to say, because the last thing we want is it taking 5 years to deal with a problem when there's a simple solution for it. So if there's unwanted bureaucracy causing a problem, then I'd like to try and help that. So please send me all of the information. Happy to have that conversation with the EA, and let's see what can be done.
Patrick Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are loads of landowners in Suffolk who want to take steps to mitigate flooding. The problem is they need a flood risk assessment permit. The thing about FRAPs is they're expensive and hard to come by. So what can the department do to make them easier to access and cheaper? Because I think it would make a real difference if they did so.
Yeah. Thank you. And another interesting and thoughtful question. I'm happy to sort of look into this in some more detail for him. Because again, I kind of think as a new government, if we're looking at rules and regulations that aren't working, we don't need to keep them. So if it's not working, let's change things, let's make things better. Send me through the information and let me have a proper look at it.
Claire Young.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Returning to the issue of wider infrastructure in surface water flooding, recent examples in my constituency include a householder who's been affected by water running from an incomplete major housing development who's been told that nothing can be enforced until the development is finished, and another where a road safety scheme is funneling water into their property. What action will the government take to ensure that infrastructure is being designed with surface water flooding in mind, and to ensure that developers have to provide appropriate drainage right the way through the build-out of major developments?
Thank the Honourable Lady for the question, and I'm really sorry to hear that her constituents facing that incredibly unfair situation for anybody to have to deal with. This is part of the reason, going back to SUDS and the fact that Schedule 3 was never enacted from the 2010 legislation that we brought in, why that's so important and why we're looking at that now, because it needs to have adequate drainage. There needs to be a sustainable urban drainage system in new designs. It should have been there since 2010. That government didn't do it. This government's serious about getting on with it.
Andrew Snowden.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to echo the comments of my honourable friend, the member for Broxbourne, that whilst I'm incredibly grateful to a lot of frontline workers from the Environment Agency and elsewhere for the work they have done to keep houses and businesses safe, however, we've not always seen the best of the Environment Agency as an organisation. Councillor Tommy Threlfall, who's our Cabinet member, was desperately, along with other community members and business owners, trying to get hold of someone at the Environment Agency to listen to them whilst all the fields around Main Drain were flooding and not one of the pumps at Lytham Pump Station was active, as there was about to be a high tide into the low flatlands the Minister referred to, which are at the tail end of the risk of flooding as the water moves downstream. So can I ask the Minister what she's going to do to help local communities better engage with agencies such as the Environment Agency in the midst of flooding to get real-time information into the organisation and, most importantly, actually acted upon to keep businesses and residences safe?
And thank the honourable gentleman for his question. And obviously, where the Environment Agency, you haven't had the experience that you need, then I'm very happy to take that up as an issue. And in fact, my honourable friend mentioned on the call last Friday a really good idea, which was issuing for MPs sort of emergency flood pack, which would have all of the details and information on who to contact and when, so that you would have, so the honourable member would have that information when he needed it and be able to get hold of people exactly at the point when they've had to, because this has been an issue that's come out, especially over it being New Year's Eve, that people were out there working, the EA was out there working, but making sure that they've got that communication is so incredibly important. So I'm thinking through different ways that can improve communication, but I'll make sure the area manager gets in contact with them.
Chris Coughlin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Dorking and Hawley, in my constituency, many constituents have been affected by flooding overnight, but it's been particularly bad in Hawley, where for the second time in recent months, their homes have been flooded by raw sewage. So will the Minister meet with me to discuss what can be done to hold Thames Water to account, to upgrade their sewage works, particularly in light of the fact that there are several housing developments coming in the area that's going to make the problem even worse, and stop them dumping raw sewage in my residents' homes?
That's a horrific experience. I'm so sorry they've dealt with that. Of course, I'll meet with him, but this is why it's so important that we have that £88 billion of investment in terms of improving infrastructure and upgrades with the water system, so that we don't keep having incidents like the horrific one he's mentioned.
Shaukat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As members of both sides of the House have already mentioned, one of the major causes of flooding is the blockage of our drainage systems and our gullies. Unfortunately, many councils nationally have reduced the frequency of the cleaning of these gullies due to budgetary pressures. Areas like my landlocked constituency of Leicester South are seeing flooded like never before, and my local health centre, the Victoria Park Health Centre, is flooded as we speak. Will the Minister commit to providing more funding for councils to assist our larger agencies like the Environmental Agency?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for highlighting as well the impact not just that flooding has upon homes, but it has upon medical facilities as well. And it is important, but it needs to be looked at in the round of what makes the most difference in terms of improving flood resilience within a community. One of the things I've mentioned to many other people so far is the Build Back Better scheme, and there can be an extra £10,000 to make properties more flood resilient, and this might be something that it would be good to have a conversation about in terms of other houses in the local area so that we can improve property flood resilience, because it's not going to be solved by one thing. One thing is not going to fix the flooding. We need to be looking at as many different things as we can, having those accumulating together to make the biggest impact.
Final question, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for her statement and for her clear energy and commitment to try and make lives better across the United Kingdom. Well done. Obviously, the rain of the last few weeks thereabouts has experienced significant flooding, and some would say biblical proportions of flooding. And that has led to many roads being closed and air travel affected for many. Disruption is extensive across the middle and northeast of England and other parts of the United Kingdom. So what has been done to minimise travel disruption for so many going back to work and others are going back to school in this week? Thank you.
And I thank my honourable friend, and I'm delighted he's the last question on my first statement, so thank you very much for that. In terms of what can be done, obviously we need to continue through the Flood Resilience Task Force to work with other departments to look at how we can improve resilience, how we can ensure people get back to work. Obviously, as he knows, flooding and water is a devolved matter, but it's always good to get him in at the end.
That concludes the flooding statements. I'll let the front bench have a few moments to swap over.